Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. We are also on Patreon, and you can find us by searching on Patreon for The History of the Papacy or The History of the Papacy podcast. You can follow the link in the show notes. There are many great benefits to becoming a patron. You get to be on the exclusive club, The History of the Papacy Diptychs. Now, in traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops that are commemorated during the Mass or liturgy. And if you become a patron on Patreon, you will be commemorated on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. Now, not only will you be on the History of the Papacy Diptychs, that exclusive club, you'll also get on the bonus feed of the History of the Papacy, where you'll receive all new episodes early and ad-free. You'll also get our exclusive new audio of our YouTube-only History of the Papacy in 10 Minutes or Less series. Your support is huge and key in keeping this whole operation going, so I thank you so much for becoming a member of the History of the Papacy on Patreon. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy Diptychs. We have Joran and William at the Alexandria level and Paul the Magnificent at Constantinople. Now this is part 2 of a 2-part collaboration with Terry Young of the History of the Early Church podcast. In the last episode, we kind of set the scene for Martyrs and talked about the context and historiography of the early church martyrs. Today, we'll get into more of the details of Christian martyrs and martyrdom and talk about a framework to look at the individual martyr stories. You can even play at home, so I hope you enjoy, and I'll talk to you soon. It's always interesting to look at the demographics. The Christians are growing into these key areas, and even if their numbers aren't huge as a percentage of the entire population, their growth was enormous from the early 200s to the 300s. When you're talking about, the numbers, you hear all the numbers get thrown about, but the numbers are is close to made up. They're so extrapolated.
Right.
You can't really put too much credence, but you're talking about an insignificant minority to, even if they're at the absolute highest number of 25%, the way the population is weighted, they're big in the cities, so they're noticed. Maybe they're a little bit higher than 25% in certain cities, and
Right.
that is, and like you said, so they're involved in key industries, they're involved in key parts of the administration, and they're seen to be growing. That can leave them open to a lot of trouble when people are seen as a outsider minority, sometimes called a middleman minority, where if things are going well and they're ingrained in society but seen as the other, that's not so bad. When things start going bad in society and you're seen as an outsider but you're still ingrained in society, that can cause a lot of trouble for that group.
Yep. And it's interesting. There almost was a reversion, at least according to Eusebius and Lactantius, back to persecution in the 270s. And this is an interesting. This sort of illustrates how well Christians had ingrained themselves into society, but also how quickly things could change if things went bad. There's a very kind of famous incident happened in Antioch where the Christians there deposed their bishop because he for heresy and immorality, but they couldn't get rid of him because Syria was under the control of a rebellious faction of the empire. When that faction was defeated and the secular support that was backing the deposed bishop was gone, the Christians of Antioch as Roman citizens, appealed to the emperor. Not a lot of people know that. They think that Constantine is like the first emperor that gets petitioned by the Christian church. But the emperor in this case, Aurelian, the emperor who famously put the empire back into being one empire again, defeated the two breakaway pieces of the empire. They appealed to him and said, look, we can't get our church building back. We have declared he's no longer a valid member of our community. And this petition was brought to Aurelian, and he decided that whichever faction in the Church of Antioch agrees with the churches in Italy, whichever side the Bishop of Rome and the Italian bishops side with, that's the one he'll support, which happened to be the one which the bishops in Italy were against the deposed Bishop of Antioch. And so imperial authorities came in and kicked him out. And the Christians there who opposed him got their church building back. But supposedly, Lactantius and Eusebius, and just for anyone, I'm sure both our listeners are well familiar with Eusebius and probably Lactantius, but they're early Christian writers, Eusebius from Palestine, Lactantius from North Africa, who wrote about history and persecution. Eusebius, of course, famous church historian. Both say that basically Aurelian almost launched a new persecution. Maybe he was put off by the whole event. We don't know. But he was assassinated before that happened. So as far as Christians had come, it was sort of kind of that potential return of the threat was there. And of course, 25 years later, or 30 years later, it would ultimately return, which of course gets us to the early 4th century, the critical turning point in all this. And so the Emperor Diocletian comes to power in 284. Stephen, I think you've done episodes covering Diocletian's reform extensively, so I won't get too into the weeds there. But basically, he, among other things, he associates himself with 3 colleagues, the Tetrarchy, rule of 4 different emperors, institutes all these reforms. And in the final years of his reign, he launches the Great Persecution. He becomes convinced that at the end of the day, Christianity is still a threat to the peace of the gods, and it does need to be suppressed. And that the Great Persecution is the sort of longest sustained persecution of Christians in the empire. It lasts for a full decade in the East, although it ends in different parts of the empire at different times. In the Western Empire, in the regions of Britain and Gaul, it never really gets off the ground because the emperor there, Constantius Chlorus, the father of Constantine the Great, doesn't agree with the policy, and so demolishes a few churches and contents himself with that. When Constantine and then another figure named Maxentius come to power in the West, they end the persecution there in 306 officially. In the Balkans, it ends in 311 with the dying Galerius, Diocletian's protege, who is kind of the driving influencer on Diocletian's decision to launch his persecution. And his kind of last dying edict, he issues formal toleration. But his nephew, Maximinus Daia, the emperor of the East, refuses to end it. He's kind of the most fanatical and creative and probably the worst of all the persecutors of the early Christians. I know Nero and Diocletian get a lot of attention, but I think Maximinus Daia is actually probably worse than all of them in a way. It doesn't end until he's really defeated in 313. And after that, Christianity is, for the most part, legal from that point onward, because, of course, the conversion of Constantine happens in 312. There is a brief resumption of persecution under Constantine's former ally and brother-in-law Licinius, who actually defeated Maximinus Daia. After Licinius and Constantine have a falling out. It's much more limited, though. It's not quite on the scale of before. And after Constantine defeats Licinius and becomes the sole emperor, that is really the end of pagan imperial persecutions of Christians and kind of closes the door on that period. So that is the broad framework. In the early centuries, Christianity is subject to local sporadic persecution. They gained some respectability, though, in the early 3rd century. In the mid-3rd century, you have the first imperial persecutions, followed by a long period of peace. and then the great persecution under Diocletian in the early 4th century, as well as a brief persecution a little bit later under Licinius. And then after that, it is over, and the empire is set on its course to becoming a Christianized Roman Empire. So that is the broad framework that we need to keep in mind, I think, for the rest of this discussion. We'll be coming back to it, I think, quite a few times, and there's a lot of details and kind of key turning points within that framework that the legendary view, excessively skeptical view, don't really touch on. So that is the broad framework to keep in mind. The early centuries, local sporadic persecution. Christians get a measure of respectability in the early 3rd century. Mid-3rd century, we have the first imperial persecutions, and then we have that long period of peace. And then in the early 4th century, we get Diocletian, the great persecution. And then after that, a brief persecution under Licinius, but that is basically the end of the era of Roman persecution of early Christians. And so that is the broad framework that we need to keep in mind.
It's probably worth saying that the drive for Roman persecution didn't end with Christianity. It just shifted focus. The Romans, their real idea for persecuting is that they wanted they wanted an empire that had a religion. That didn't, they still had those same goals after the persecution of the Christians. We'll see that guiding principle of why they persecuted the Christians is still there for as long as there's a Roman Empire. It just starts to change its who it's persecuting after that. It might be groups inside of Christianity, it might be other religious groups, but if there's still that the reasons why the Romans persecuted religions stay around for a long time afterwards.
Yes, and that gets into what we mentioned earlier, that the fundamental way of thinking about religion in the state, it goes from being the Pax Deorum to the or the peace of the gods to the peace of gods. Constantine and his successors still hold to that same idea that we need to offer God now the proper unified worship that is his due, meaning there needs to be a unified church, and only the correct, the Catholic Orthodox Church can offer to God the right worship, and that which is opposed to that is potentially a threat to that. So
shift now, we're going to shift our focus a little bit to some of the specific stories of the martyrs. What is maybe let's take a couple of case studies of martyrs and discuss how we should really properly look at them.
Yes. So there's kind of, when it comes to martyrdom accounts, there's kind of two approaches right now among scholars. There are those who do what is called critical hagiography, and this is applying historical critical methodology to martyrdom accounts to try to determine if they're reliable and what information can we glean from them. And then the other approach is more of a literary analysis. It's not really interested in what possible history this text may record. It's more interested in what does it tell us about its author's beliefs or the community it was written in. Now, just as a bit of a side note, apparently this is a little bit of a fight among scholars, at least from the reading I've done. There are some that sort of advocate one approach over the other and don't like the other approach. I don't know why this has to be a fight. Personally, I think both approaches are valid because they're both asking different questions and using different ways to get there, and they seem to complement each other well. But
yeah, they do seem like they would complement each other if you're trying to either, if the ultimate goal is to get to what's historically accurate, you would probably need to use two of those two would seem to be the tools you would use.
Yes, and even you could talk about how the memory of a martyr and how they were venerated, how that was important to later communities, and what role that played historically in the lives of people. If you're doing social history or something, And that doesn't mean that someone else can't come along and try to find out who that martyr actually was historically. You can do both. You can do both, and they don't need to be in conflict. That's just I don't know. You ever sometimes read some works of history and you can tell there's a bit of a dispute among scholars about something, and you think, why does that have to be a fight? I think you guys are both right about this.
Is it sort of the way that the critical approach to the New Testament is that there's, are they applying some of the similar tools that they use for that study into the study of the martyrs?
Yeah, I would imagine so, because you're doing literary and historical critical analysis in these approaches. So, and you're dealing with how a person has been remembered by their community, and you're trying to, in some cases, see through that to the historical person behind the memory. And disentangling those things can be challenging. So there is definitely some parallels there, I think, with New Testament studies, and really any ancient literature, to be honest, any historical writing from antiquity.
Yeah, because you're looking at documents that were not written as factual. It wasn't journalism. There was, I mean, and you could say that journalism has a lot of issues as well of creating narrative, but people weren't documenting things strictly strictly objectively. There was always a certain amount of subjectivity built into these narratives, even if they were written at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. And anyone, of course, who's familiar with Greek and Roman history, that's not news to them either.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what was Caligula as bad as Suetonius makes him out to be? You know,
Yeah.
or how much of that is Suetonius's senatorial biases? Doesn't mean we throw Suetonius out. It just means that we have to do the hard work of digging and analyzing. So, which is often very fun, very interesting. So,
Who's maybe what martyr's story might be a good one to start off with to dip our toes into this hard work?
well, I kind of want to, before getting into some of the specifics, I'll mention a few, but I kind of want to lay out kind of the ways that scholars go about looking at martyrdom accounts, and what tools and methods they apply to it to try to recover history from the text.
Yeah, let's dig in.
So, what we'll be doing, kind of really what we're discussing, is the critical hagiography approach. So with this, we're not so much talking about how we're not reading the martyrdom accounts to find out what later Christians may have believed. We're trying to read them to find out about the actual martyrs themselves. So, some general points to keep in mind is which kind of relates to that. One is the historicity of a martyrdom account versus the historicity of the martyr themselves. And actually, a good example of this is St. George. St. George, very famous early Christian martyr, who, of course, in artwork, he's frequently, depicted slaying a dragon, very famous scene that you can find in Eastern and Western Christian art from all over the world. Now, we know, few scholars from what I've read doubt that there was actually a martyr named George, who was killed in the early 4th century. And that mainly has to do with that his cult, his veneration, is attested to fairly early on, and he pops up frequently. But the written accounts we have about George are just way off base. It just unfortunately do not tell us almost nothing about the historical George. What we know about the historical martyr George is he was a Roman soldier, probably from Cappadocia. He seems to have been executed in Palestine during the reign of Diocletian, and that's about it. That is pretty much all we can say.
3
about
bullet
George.
points.
Yep. And sadly, that is true for a lot of martyrs. There is a lot of legendary writing that has obscured the historical person, and disentangling that takes a lot of time and effort. In some cases, isn't actually possible. There are some martyrdom accounts, which, as I mentioned with George, that the texts we have are just such a mixed bag that we can't know what we can use. Others are more mixed, but when it comes to the texts themselves. And I'm taking there are kind of 5 categories that scholars put them into. And for listeners that want to know, I'm taking this from Timothy Barnes's book, The New Empire of Diocletian and Constantine. This is from page 176. And he got these categories from a famous hagiographer, hagiography meaning like Lives of Saints, Hippolyte Delahaye, I think I'm saying the name right, but very famous scholar who kind of came up with these categories. So category 1 are official acts. These are Roman trial transcripts, actual court documents. An example of this, the church father Justin Martyr, we have the trial transcript of him and his companions before the prefect of Rome in the mid-2nd century. The second group are literary first-hand accounts, sometimes called passions. They may incorporate some elements of Roman trial transcripts in the sense that they might have dialogue in there. They're of a different type of genre. They're not obviously court documents. They're this is someone a witness to the event who's writing a record of what happened. So a good example of this is the martyrdom of Polycarp of Smyrna in the mid-2nd century. Polycarp, a famous early church father, is one of the apostolic fathers, Johannine disciples. The third group are texts which use groups 1 and 2 as their sources. And I'm going to come back to that group because this one has some interesting things with it. Group 4 are legendary or epic passions. These are literary accounts which are not historical. Again, the martyr may be historical and often is, but the account itself is legendary. And then the 5th category are what are called are put it bluntly, forgeries. They are not historical works. They are not even legends based off historical people. They are intentionally deceptive. So someone has written this with a contemporary aim, often to hoodwink readers or what have you. So really then what the business of critical hagiography is, okay, we have all these texts. We need them into these 5 buckets. They're in buckets 1 and 2. If they're trial transcripts or they're first-hand literary accounts, that's good. Those are the texts we want, Yes, we still have to analyze them, but that is those are sources that we can actually use to reconstruct the past. If they're in categories 4 or 5, forgery, obviously, it's a legendary text. Again, you like with George, we might find out a name, a place, and an approximate date, and that's about it. Now, the middle category 3, so texts that use acts or passions as sources, this is the most problematic because you could have something that puts very alteration. So you could have maybe you have a trial transcript of a martyr and somebody has added an introductory and concluding paragraph. Because maybe, a lot of these acts of martyrs would be read on their feast day in church. So maybe the bishop or presbyter, whoever made this copy, has added some context for the congregation, right? Give them some background. So very minimal. We can easily isolate what's been added from the original record. So that, that's basically, it's still very good. And then there are other texts which have decided to take authentic information and use that as a jumping off point to embellish and add and throw in all sorts of other things which aren't necessarily accurate. So an example of this is the martyrdom of Theodotus of Ankara. Theodotus is a historical martyr. He died in 311 or 312 in the Great Persecution. He's from Galatia. And we even get a few nuggets of useful information. I'll bring up this text again when we get into some of the details. But it has some anachronistic references to Galileans, which for listeners who may not know, Constantine's nephew, Leon the Apostate, famously the last pagan emperor, bringing the empire back to its traditional religion and get away from Christianity. He kind of popularized in his day the referring to Christians as Galileans, which is not something really our sources from earlier periods don't have that. This text, though, has that, and it's quite clear. There's some parallels, I think, with some things that happened in Julian's day, and it also includes some tropes that are not are suspicious. We'll come back to this one, but that's an example of we have a mixed bag. Although that one's actually one of the better ones because it's actually easier to identify what's historical and what's not. There's other texts where that's very difficult. So, but those are our 5 buckets, and we want the stuff in categories 1 and 2 and maybe 3 if it's good. So Roman transcripts, first-hand literary accounts, and texts which have used one or both of those first 2 categories and haven't mutilated them too much. So, of course, now that leads to our next question. How do we actually determine what bucket a text goes in?
That's got to be the really tough work.
Yes, and this is where this involves a lot of work, which it's not always the most exciting reading. It's not going to get your book on a bestseller list, but it's the rigorous, detailed historical work that, when done right, can really pay dividends. So the first thing to do, since we're talking about Roman persecution, first thing I would do is, what I would call this Roman fact checking. So for one, does it fit the framework that we talked about of Roman persecution, that grand narrative of for the first 3 centuries? So, for instance, you have a lot of martyrdom accounts, which are about a martyr who was supposedly executed under Diocletian, but they have in their account Diocletian is executing Christians all throughout his 20 years on the throne. But we know from the framework, Diocletian didn't start putting Christians to death until the final years of his reign. That's a detail that, a contemporary source like Lactantius or Eusebius would have just known by virtue of the fact of being alive at that time, but that an author 100, 200, 300 years later either A, doesn't know about, or B, doesn't actually care about the intricate details of the historical past. So that's one. Does it fit the framework? Does it get facts right? So, it's very basic stuff, but does it name the emperor? If it gives a date, does it name the right emperor? Again, that seems so simple, but you'd be surprised how, certain things, like I don't even think in some of the accounts of George, they don't even name Diocletian right. He's King something begins with a D. I forget what the name is. So not even that's right. They couldn't even get the name of the Roman emperor right, or his title. I know it sounds kind of silly, but we have to start there. Does it give the name? If it's using a dating system, if it's using the Roman one, of course, is consular, right? The Romans would name the year after the ordinary consuls at the beginning, right? In the consulship of so and so and so and so, right? Okay. If it says it's during the reign of this emperor in their 5th year, and it says it was in the consulship of so and so and so and so, does it get that right? There are actually a lot of lists that preserve the names of Roman consuls for every year. And there are scholars who have put those together. So we actually know the names of the consuls for all of the different years. Does it get that correct? Again, very, very simple, but the way to tell if this is somebody using good information or somebody that's just making it up or relying on later legend.
So really with these group 3s where they're using the acts and they're using the passions, so you could have somebody who maybe is legitimately trying to put those 2 sources together to tell what really happened, but you could also have the bishop of so-and-so who's taken a little of this, a little of that to tell a good story.
Yes.
And then potentially you could have another bishop after the fact who's taken what that bishop's written and takes a little bit more to embellish the story, to tell a good story, stories that are impactful for their audience. So you get a lot of layers of,
Yes.
like you had used when we were talking off air, a lot of chaffs getting piled onto that wheat.
Yes. Yes. And it's not always necessarily a negative motivation. There was a Christian Spanish poet named Prudentius in the late 4th or 5th century who wrote poems on Spanish martyrs. I actually had a listener ask me, why didn't I go too far into the martyrs of Spain and point to this text? Problem is Prudentius's work, even he lamented in his own day how most of the reliable records of Spanish martyrs under the great persecution had been lost, and so that's why he wrote his poems. But scholars recognize his poems tell us way more about what he and his people believed about the martyrs than they actually tell us about the martyrs. He wasn't acting in bad faith. He did it because he wanted to try to preserve their memory. Unfortunately, he seems to have been a generation or two late. And then, other accounts might be written to enhance the status of some particular locations. If this church was the location of this very famous martyr, well, that will bring people there to venerate the cult site, and obviously be good for that city, with commerce and what have you. Or it might enhance a bishop's position if his see is connected with a martyr of some kind. A lot of it's just, I think a lot of it is trying to put meat on bones, where, like George, they have a name, they have a place, they have a approximate date, and that's it. And the people want to know who this person was. Like, we commemorate them every year in the liturgy. Why? On their feast day, who were they? Well, we need a good story.
That ties in really well to a lot of the apocryphal gospels. I can't remember the scholar who said this, but a lot of things like that are essentially the ancient version of fan fiction.
Yes.
The story hasn't told enough, and people want what's the meat of the story? They want meat put on the bones of the story, and that's a natural.
It is.
It's a natural human thought. I mean, that's why we have fan fiction. Or like 50 Star Wars novels that have completely departed from the what the actual books have said, and that's why there really is such a battle to preserve a canon,
right?
Is because you want
ironic, huh? Early church canon. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It is a really interesting a phenomenon, and this is happening really organically too, where it's it's just getting layers upon layers added to it. And it, like you said, it could be out of bad intentions, but it could also be in the very best of intentions, or for different purposes at different times that weren't necessarily negative.
Correct. Yes, absolutely. So with another thing with Roman fact checking is, does it name the provincial governor? Does it give their title? And does it name the province? There are people, Stephen, God bless them, who go through every law, every inscription, every shred of evidence they can find from antiquity, and they will literally try to put together a complete list of every Roman province ever, what its name was, how that name changed, as well as the name of every governor ever, and try to find what their correct title was. It's painstaking, long work, but we actually do know the names of a lot of Roman governors. And it's actually kind of funny. Some of them, we can kind of trace their careers through other, texts and what have you.
Okay, so let's just go over that again, because there's a lot of nuggets in there.
Yeah.
What's in that martyrdom account?
Yeah, so let's say you found a martyrdom account and it claimed that this is about a martyr who was executed under Trajan, and the governor that put him to death was the Praetorian prefect of Palestine.
Okay, so I'm certainly no expert in this, but it sounds like there could be a problem that the leader of Palestine at that time might not have been a Praetorian prefect, and Palestine maybe wasn't its own province at that time. I think it may have been split and incorporated into another province. That's my guess.
Yeah, so you're close. So obviously, the Praetorian prefect is not a provincial governor. In Trajan's age, that office was in charge of the Praetorian Guard. So there's no Praetorian prefect of Palestine. And then Palestine wasn't called Palestine under Trajan, was it? It was still called Judea. It's his successor, Hadrian, who called it Palestine. So here we have a careless error in terms of naming the governor as far as their title goes, and an anachronism as far as what the name of the province is. So that's the kind of thing that if you see that in a martyrdom account will jump out. Other ways to evaluate the account, kind of look for suspicious tropes. Now, not stylized or very formalized accounts that recycle these tropes, such as exaggerated torture that would actually kill a real person 5 times over, but somehow the martyr lives through it. that Theodotus of Ankara I mentioned earlier is an example of that. Romantic elements where, often when the Roman emperor is actually present, in the authentic martyrdom accounts, the Roman emperor is very rarely physically there. But a lot of legendary accounts, of course, want to make it dramatic and have the emperor actually in the story, Now, some positive indicators of authenticity is one, it fits the framework. It gets Roman facts correct. It doesn't fall into these very stylized, trope-heavy format. And it also has those kind of earmarks of authenticity. It preserves these odd, unique details that are really don't have any sort of ulterior purpose. They're just kind of little nuggets of information that have that ring of authenticity. Like only someone who was there would have mentioned this, and it's not something that there's no other motivation to include it in there, kind of thing. So I think it would be good to conclude with some test examples. I think will illustrate some of the points we've discussed. So I'll start off with two kind of legendary ones, and then get to some more historical ones. So this is an easy one. There is a Christian martyr named Saint Alexandra the Empress, or Saint Alexandra of Rome, and she is supposedly the wife of Diocletian, and she was martyred under her husband for her Christian faith. Problem is, we know the name of Diocletian's wife. It was not Alexandra, it was Prisca, and she was executed by Licinius in a dynastic purge that had nothing to do with her supposed Christianity. Now, there is an earlier version of her story which has her as the wife of a governor, which I suspect, if there's any history to the story at all, that's probably what it was, and she was later upgraded to being the wife of the emperor. One of, I think, the best examples is a martyr named Saint Procopius of Scythopolis. Procopius was a reader and exorcist in the Church of Palestine. He was also a Syriac interpreter, so he was bilingual. He would, because you have Christians speaking Syriac and Greek in that region. And he was known personally to Eusebius of Caesarea, and Eusebius commemorates a martyrdom account about him in his work. But if you Google a picture of Procopius of Scythopolis, he's dressed as a soldier. And you might scratch your head and go, why is Procopius dressed as a soldier? And it's because in later medieval legend, he evolved into one of the great military saints, up there with George and Demetrius and others. So the historical person that Eusebius knew has been replaced by this legendary soldier who bears almost no resemblance to the historical figure. And if we didn't have Eusebius's account, we might never know that. That just shows you the degree to which later legend can take over from the historical person. And it's good that we have Eusebius, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to get past that, probably.
So those are two good examples of real Hollywood hagiographies.
Oh, yeah. So now I want to get to two positive examples. So the first one, this is a well-known martyrdom account, the Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicity. And they were two women who were martyred in Carthage in 203 under the Emperor Septimius Severus. Wasn't ordered by him, but it was just during his reign. Their martyrdom account is interesting because it's actually part of it's actually a journal that Perpetua herself wrote when she was in prison. I say journal. Well, yeah, journal would probably be the best way. And then another martyr, a male martyr who was also killed in this, he wrote as well. And a local Carthaginian Christian who seems to have known them took their accounts and edited it together into his eyewitness narrative. Now, one of the things this text does is it has the unintentional precision accuracy that an authentic source will get right, but a later source could not have gotten right. So if you, some of you might if you know your Roman history, the emperor I mentioned, Septimius Severus, when he died, his two boys took over the empire, Caracalla and Geta, and they hated each other. They were at each other's throats. And eventually Caracalla killed his younger brother Geta and damned his memory, and did a really good job of it, actually. Such a good job of it that Geta's birthday is not attested to in any other source. We kind of learned that it was sometime in the spring, but his actual day of birth is not mentioned anywhere except the Passion of Perpetua and Felicity. Because as part of the setting, it mentions that on March 7th that year in 203, they were being exposed to the beasts in the arena in honor of the Caesar, because Geta wasn't emperor yet, he was still just Caesar, in 203 in honor of his birthday. It has nothing to do with the main purpose of that text. It's just mentioned because that's part of the setting, but it preserves a fact about a Roman emperor that we would have lost otherwise because of Caracalla's damning of his brother's memory. And it's something a later writer could not have known and would not have had access to.
No, there's no reason.
Right, and there's no reason. And again, the text doesn't mention that to mention it. It just brings it up because it explains why they're being killed in the arena today. That's so that's that unintentional precision accuracy. And then the last one that I want to mention, this is actually a letter by the Bishop of Alexandria, Dionysius, who survived both the Decian and Valerian persecutions. And he was accused of cowardice by a fellow bishop, and he circulated a letter after the persecutions to try to clear his name and prove that he was not a coward. And he included in one of his letters his actual court transcript before the acting prefect of Egypt. Because one thing that sometimes gets brought up is, how were Christians able to get a hold of trial transcript records? Like, why would Roman authorities have given those to them? We do know from papyri evidence from Egypt that private citizens could get court transcripts, like family members and what have you. They could get copies of those. Now, whether Christians did that through the normal means or maybe bribed the official or what have you, we're not sure. But either way, they could get copies of those. And as a way of just kind of confirming this, so Dionysius included what he claimed was the copy of his trial transcript in his letter. And what's interesting, in his letter, he sort of summarizes the proceedings, and he gives a very nice summary of that really makes him sound very brave and what have you, and very direct with the Roman governor. When you actually read the transcript he includes, though, it's a bit more muted. He doesn't come off as a coward, but he doesn't, in the actual court record, he doesn't quite sound so forceful and so direct as he does in his summary. Now, that may seem, okay, that's a minor difference. He's exaggerating a bit to try to make himself better. True. But the fact that he's able to do that demonstrates that trial transcript in his letter is not something he doctored up, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to slightly misrepresent it.
There's so many different ways you can dig into these documents, and that the fact that he had a documentary proof is pretty cool.
Yeah. And it's a good way of it's another piece of the puzzle that sheds light on this. So those are some. I know we had to I had to run through those quick, but I hope listeners have found that interesting. Those are some of the ways that scholars evaluate martyrdom accounts and try to separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out what's reliable and what's not, and what can we use.
I kind of think that we have we have the possibility of another collaboration here, of a little game show of pick out the problems with this martyrdom account.
We could, yeah, it'd be funny.
Well, I think we really have just scratched the tip of the iceberg on this episode, but I want to thank you for doing all this hard work for this collaboration. And like I said, I think we do have a lot more to talk about this.
Oh, yeah, we could. Honestly, just one of these texts could be an episode in its own.
Thanks again, Terry, so much for joining me on the history of the papacy and allowing me to join on your show. There's so many overlaps with what we talk about, and like in this episode, we took one little thing and really expanded on it. So I think you'll definitely be hearing us together again soon, and I hope sooner rather than later.
Yes, absolutely, and thank you, Stephen.
Deus,